You are listening to Odyssey, the podcast, history's other most awesome epic. This is episode 9. Today's episode is titled Telemachus, Menelaus, and Helen of Troy. So welcome back, folks, and you are now listening to episode number 9 of Odyssey the podcast, an episode I'm choosing to title Telemachus, Menelaus, and Helen of Troy. Now it was day 3 of Athena's rescue mission to Ithaca. The first 2 days have been spent around the palace, helping Telemachus to identify his public speaking abilities and skills, and now on day 3, Athena had suggested that Telemachus might want to take a road trip. She wanted to get him out of Ithaca. She wanted to get him away from the overly protective skirts of his mother Penelope, and she wanted to get him away from the increasing danger and the threat of the 108 bully boy suitors who were considering killing Telemachus. So Athena had suggested that, why don't you take a road trip? You could go to the kingdom of Pylos, the home of your dad's old wartime buddy, King Nestor, and then from Pylos you could sail on or hike overland on to Sparta and meet your dad's wartime buddy, Menelaus. The two men might be able to give you some information on your missing father. Now, of course, Athena could have spared Telemachus the entire time and trouble of the trip by simply turning to the young man and saying, "Don't worry about your dad, he's very much alive. We just spirited him off of the island of a sea nymph named Calypso, and he is currently residing with a wonderful group of people called the Phaeacians, and oh, by the way, he'll be home in a matter of days, so no need for you to worry at all." But that, of course, would not have done a thing for Telemachus' maturation process. It would have been boring as heck for the playful goddess of wisdom, Athena, and, well, no self-respecting storyteller, Homer included, would have been willing to destroy the entire suspense of the second half of the Odyssey by simply telling Telemachus and telling Penelope that, don't worry, your dad or your husband is indeed going to be coming home. So, we needed this road trip. Telemachus and Athena incidentally disguised as the copper trader Mentor, sailed all night long, and in the morning they arrived at the kingdom of Pylos. Now, if you traveled with me through Trojan War, the podcast, you already know King Nestor of Pylos very well indeed. King Nestor, going back 20 years to the very start of the Trojan War epic, was, how do I put this, a very well-meaning but very long-winded teller of stories. And, ladies and gentlemen, to be charitable to Nestor, if you could hang in, if you could be patient, and if you could wait and listen without nodding off, then usually at the end of Nestor's long-winded speeches was some real nugget of genuine wisdom. Now, Telemachus, of course, knew absolutely nothing about Nestor's reputation as a long-winded storyteller. All that Telemachus knew about Nestor is that Nestor was a hero, a capital H-E-R-O hero from his father's generation of heroes. And consequently, Telemachus, arriving at the gates of Nestor's palace in Pylos, was understandably scared to death. He had never talked to a man from his father's mythic generation. So as they approached the gates, Mentor/Athena in the lead and Telemachus faltering more and more cautiously behind, Athena had actually had to buck up the lad's courage. "Now, Telemachus, you must not be shy. Go right up to Nestor. That is why you sailed here, Telemachus." "But Mentor," Telemachus had replied, "how can I speak to Nestor? How can I put myself forward like that? I'm not an experienced speaker, and as a young man, I feel awkward talking to elders." And folks, just an aside, but I think that Athena, aside from being the goddess of practical wisdom, must have also been the goddess of eternal patience with immature young teenagers. Because by this point, you begin to think that what Athena would like to reply is, Telemachus, damn it, just grow a pair, go up and talk to the man. But it's not actually what she said. Rather, she, or mentor he, kept his or her cool and responded as follows. Telemachus, just start speaking. Surely some god will put the right words into your mouth. I do not think you were born without heaven's favor, Telemachus. And of course, Athena knew that she would be the god providing Telemachus with the necessary deific courage. So, they approached the gates of Nestor's palace. Well, soon they were observed, and immediately flawless, absolutely flawless textbook Xenia followed. And for the next few pages of Homer's Odyssey, well, there is lots of eating, lots of drinking, lots of libations, and lots of prayers made to the Olympian gods. And Athena, disguised as mentor, is having a particularly fine old time in this section of the Odyssey, as she proposes toast after toast and prayer after prayer to none other than, well, herself. But eventually, once all of the guests were fully fed, fully washed, fully watered, and entirely taken care of, Xenia-wise, then it was appropriate for Nestor to pose the now appropriate question. Strangers, who are you? Oh, where did you sail from? Why have you come? Are you on a trading voyage? Or do you wander at random over the seas? Like pirates, risking your own lives and bringing ruin to other men. And folks, if that particular passage sounds familiar to you, then, well, it should. And I need to remind you that the Odyssey was originally not a book, but was actually a live story, and Homer's Odyssey, most scholars agree, would have taken about 24 hours of live performance time to tell. And so given such a massive amount of content to memorize, well, Bronze Age storytellers developed a whole series of repeatable stock phrases that they could insert into different places into the plot where appropriate. And what you have just heard from Nestor is one of those stock phrases. So you heard it before. You actually heard it from Polyphemus, when Odysseus and his companions arrived inside of the cave. Here's what Polyphemus said. Strangers, who are you? Why are you here? What is the country you came from? Are you here on a trading voyage, or do you wander at random over the seas, like pirates, risking your own lives and bringing ruin to other men? The very same phrase as Nestor uses, with just a slight change in tone and intonation. But, little lesson on Bronze Age storytelling and the oral tradition in place, let's return to the plot. Nestor asked the question, and Telemachus, he responded. Homer reports that, quote, Athena gave him confidence deep in his heart to ask about his absent father and to gain a noble reputation for himself. And, well, Homer wasn't exaggerating. Telemachus actually posed a thoughtful and even an eloquently phrased question. I came to gather news about my father, long-suffering Odysseus. They say that he fought with you to sack the city of Troy. So I beg you, tell me, did you see him die? Or do you have any news about where he may be? You need not sweeten what you say, in pity or from embarrassment. Just tell me straight, what your eyes saw of my father. And then, ladies and gentlemen, Nestor answered, and answered, and answered, and answered some more. And I will spare you the entire length and breadth of the answer, except for my very favorite line from it, which I will quote. If you stayed here 5 years, or even 6 years, and kept on asking me, you would get bored and go back home again before my story came to an end. But the gist of Nestor's windy answer was actually pretty grim. "Sorry, kid. The last time I saw your old man was on the day he sailed from Troy. Haven't seen or heard a thing from him since. Oh, and no doubt you have heard about Agamemnon's noble son, young Orestes. A lad about your age, I'd think. And how fortunate that Agamemnon had a son, willing to stand up and to take revenge upon the wicked people who conspired against him." And with that little pivot, well, Nestor was into the Odyssey's very favorite cautionary tale. The tale we have already heard many times of Clytemnestra, Aegisthus, and noble, vengeance-seeking young Orestes. Nestor continued, "While we fought and labored at Troy, that layabout Aegisthus sat safe at home, seducing Clytemnestra, noble wife of Agamemnon. For a while, she scorned his foul suggestions, since her heart was good. But finally, fate forced the queen to yield. And not that there's any need for you to worry about the faithlessness of your own dear mother, kid," an already much less than subtle Nestor implied. "But the moral is, if you're looking for a moral, you must not stay away too long, dear boy, when all those proud suitors are lurking around your mother inside of your father's house." And that, ladies and gentlemen, well, that pretty well concluded everything of use that Nestor had to provide to young Telemachus concerning his missing father. So the balance of Telemachus' stay on Pylos was essentially nothing more than a series of feasts, sacrifices, libations, and, of course, more long-winded stories by Nestor himself. But on the final day of the visit, there was one sensible and possibly even insightful suggestion from windy old King Nestor. Nestor suggested that Telemachus travel overland to Sparta in the company of Nestor's youngest son, a lad of about Telemachus' age named Pisistratus. And this particular son of Nestor's, all accounts seem to suggest, had, at Telemachus' age, much more of a kingly bearing, demeanor, and confidence about him than did young Telemachus. So perhaps Nestor was wise enough to recognize that what Telemachus could use at this stage was not to be mentored by an old copper trader named Mentor, but rather to be given a, well, pure positive role model, if you will, in Nestor's youngest son. So it seemed like a perfect plan. The two 20-year-old lads would take a fast chariot on the 2 days it would take to get to Sparta, and meanwhile, Mentor/Athena would bow out of the proceedings and take flight discreetly back to Ithaca to prepare the next stage of our plot. But of course, Athena, always one for the grand departure in the pyrotechnics, could not resist before she, disguised as Mentor, bowed out of the story to flash a little bit of her deific brilliance so that Nestor and all concerned would once again realize that their feasting, their banquets, their celebrations, and their deliberations had all been graced by an Olympian god. And then, well, it was time for a road trip. And folks, for young Telemachus, sheltered and kept under the protective skirts of his mother for the full 20 years of his life, this just might have been the coolest 2 days that had ever happened to the young prince. On a fast chariot, accompanied by a buddy of his own age, tooling down the Peloponnesian highway towards the kingdom of Sparta. And of course, well, there are some life skills that a mentor or a god can teach you, but there are other life skills best learned by a more mature and worldly buddy of your own age. But whatever the case, because Homer tells us nothing that happened during that 48-hour road trip, but at the end of the road trip, the fast chariot pulled in to the kingdom of Sparta. And they arrived at the palace of Menelaus and of Helen of Troy, a woman we've heard of and a woman who, well, Menelaus preferred to think of as Helen of Sparta. Now, folks, I need to pause here for a moment, because something is going to happen during Telemachus' visit with Menelaus and Helen, which is absolutely fascinating. In fact, it's deliciously indulgent and, well, gossipy in the extreme. But in order for us to have fun and to thoroughly enjoy what's going to happen, I need to provide us all with a wee little bit of a refresher on some of the details, some of the character, and some of the plot that happened way back inside of the world of Trojan War, the podcast. In short, plot that happened between 10 and 20 years earlier. So here's what we all need to know. Helen of Troy was the most beautiful woman to ever walk the face of the earth. Her mother was a Greek beauty named Leda, and her father was a rapist deadbeat dad named Zeus, king of the gods. And Helen, of course, was the offspring of Zeus's rape of Leda. Fast forward a few years to when Helen is now 14 and recognized as the most ravishing woman in the world. Her stepfather, Tyndareus, decided the best thing to do with a ravishing 14-year-old daughter was to auction her off to the highest bidder. And that was the day in which Helen became Helen of Sparta. Menelaus won the bidding war and took Helen back home. The next couple of years in the Spartan estate of Helen and Menelaus' marriage we know very little about. The only concrete detail we have is that they produced a daughter, a girl named Hermione. Fast forward a few more years. A Trojan prince arrives at the Spartan royal estate as a guest of King Menelaus. The Trojan prince's name is Paris. He's young, he's charming, he's devastatingly good-looking, and he is absolutely self-absorbed, vacuous, and clueless. And the very next thing you know, Helen and Paris are back in Troy, married to each other, and Helen of Sparta has now become Helen of Troy. Incidentally, Paris has just won himself the award as the greatest violator of the protocols of Xenia in the entire history of the planet. He arrived at his host's estate and somehow left with his host's wife. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to big gossipy question number one, which has dominated conversation on Helen, Paris, and Menelaus for the past 3,000 years. And the question is this: was Helen A, kidnapped against her will? B, did she run away voluntarily? Or C, was she compelled to leave Sparta by the will of the goddess Aphrodite? But the Greek world really didn't care about answering that question. They simply declared war on Troy, and, well, we had the Trojan War, which lasted for the next 10 deadlocked years. And then finally, in the final night of that war, 10 years into it, Odysseus conceptualized his famous wooden horse ruse, and the city of Troy burned to the ground, and every major Trojan of consequence was killed in one dire night. Now, here's what we need to know. On the night that Troy was burning to the ground, Menelaus of Sparta, part of the Greek army, spent that night storming through the burning ruins of the city of Troy, searching for Helen. Now, what he was planning on doing when he found Helen in the burning ruins remains an open question. Some authoritative scholars and sources say that Menelaus was searching for Helen so that he could kill the faithless bitch himself and watch her die. But an equal number of authoritative sources argue that for the entire 10 years in which Helen had been holed up in Troy with Paris, Menelaus had never once stopped believing that Helen was a victim abducted against her will, and he wanted nothing more than to go and save his fairy tale damsel in distress. Now, we don't know what Menelaus' motivations were, and we don't know why Helen was there. All we do know is, when Menelaus did find Helen that night in the burning ruins of the city, something happened between the two of them inside of Helen's bedroom, and the two of them emerged from the burning gates of Troy, hand in hand. And then, of course, they sailed home back to Sparta. Except that they didn't sail home back to Sparta. Somehow they got shipwrecked on the return voyage, and they spent a 7-year-long detour inside of Egypt. And during that time, Menelaus managed to accumulate a sizable hoard of treasure, making him the richest man in the entire Greek world. But now, well, Helen and Menelaus were back in a renovated, updated, and decidedly non-Spartan Sparta. And that brings us to the second large gossipy question, which has dominated conversation for the past 3,000 years. How has the marriage of Helen and Menelaus managed to deal with those awkward and difficult 10 Paris years? And in a moment, folks, we'll see the answer to that question. But that brings us back to the present. Telemachus and Pisistratus arrived at the front gates of the palace, and they appropriately begged for hospitality. And of course, in the proper protocols of Xenia, they did not identify themselves to their host. They were tired, they were hungry, they were thirsty, and after a long day of tooling down the Peloponnesian highway in a chariot, both of them were in bad need of a hot bath and some clean clothes. All of which would be provided before it would be appropriate for Menelaus to presume to ask his two young guests their names or the nature of their business. So far, so good. Except that when Menelaus saw the two young men at his front gate and took a close look at them, even through the dust and the road grime, it was very obvious to Menelaus that he was looking at Odysseus's own son. Telemachus's features, his eyes, his face, his stature were, as we know, pretty well identical to his dad's. Now, Menelaus didn't reveal this knowledge to his two guests. That would have been inappropriate. But then, shamelessly or generously, and I'll let each of you, my listeners, decide for yourself, Menelaus launched into a quite deliberate and incredibly maudlin memory of Odysseus speech. A speech clearly intended to evoke a response in Odysseus' son, Telemachus. So here's how it had happened. Telemachus and Pisistratus were being ushered by Menelaus through the palace to the guest rooms, where they, of course, would be bathed and given nice clean clothes before being treated to a wonderful meal. And as they wandered through Menelaus' rather stunning palace, Telemachus had been completely blown away by just the quality, the wealth, and the opulence of the place. Remember, Telemachus had never actually left the quite Spartan island accommodations of Ithaca. And Telemachus had quietly, under his breath, commented on the wealth to his traveling companion Pisistratus. Can you believe your eyes? Just look at the brilliance, the gold, the amber, the silver, the ivory. This house is filled with treasure. It looks as magnificent as a palace of Zeus himself. I'm in total awe. But folks, Telemachus must not have been whispering quite as low as he had intended, because Menelaus, the host, had overheard the exchange and immediately replied, "No man's palace compares to that of Zeus, dear boys, since his palace is everlasting. But when it comes to men, very few are my equals in the wealth that I have acquired. But it gives me little pleasure to own all of these riches. I would rather have come home with just a third of it, if only my comrades who had fought beside me on the plains of Troy had survived. Often I sit here, alone, heartsick with grief, soothing myself with tears, and I miss them all. But one man I miss the most of all. When I remember him, I can neither eat nor sleep, since no one labored like him. Odysseus. His destiny was suffering, and mine the endless pain of missing him." Now, ladies and gentlemen, there was absolutely no doubt that Menelaus' speech and his words were calculated to evoke an emotional response in young Telemachus, and whether we are expected to take Menelaus' protestations of grief at face value or not is really an open question. But whatever the case, the maudlin speech and the memories of Odysseus evoked its intended response on its intended audience. Poor Telemachus, doing his best to not cry anymore when he got upset. Well, Telemachus started to cry in spite of himself. and an awkward moment ensued, until the awkward moment was broken up by the arrival of a third party. Helen, Menelaus' wife, came downstairs and noticed her guests. And Helen wasted absolutely no time on the niceties or the protocols of Xenia. Immediately, Helen quite enthusiastically stated the obvious. Menelaus, my lord, do we know the names of these men who have come as our guests? Perhaps, well, I know I shouldn't speak frankly, but I feel that I must. I have never seen such a resemblance between two people as between that young man and Odysseus. He must surely be Odysseus' son. And with that, well, the protocols of Xenia broke down, and within a few moments, all was revealed. Telemachus confessed that he indeed was Odysseus' son and explained that he had come to Sparta on a mission to see if Menelaus knew anything about the whereabouts of his missing father. Well, there was still the practical matter of the baths, some fresh clothes, and then a meal to attend to, so the two travelers were sent off to the appropriate guest rooms, and sometime later, let's guess 45 minutes to an hour or so, everybody repaired downstairs again for a dinner that had been set out by Menelaus and Helen's slaves. But it turned out that the conversation turned back to missing Odysseus, and before long, Menelaus, who did seem to be in some form of ongoing and inconsolable grief at missing the man, was into his tears again, and that prompted more tears from Telemachus, and then Pisistratus ended up in tears too, because it turned out that he revealed he had had an older brother who had actually died at Troy. And so the evening was setting out to genuinely suck. Everybody was in tears, and nobody had an appetite for the splendid meal in front of them. That is, until Helen got an idea. Helen decided to save the evening by drugging the dinner wine. So here's the story. Menelaus came home from his 7 years in Egypt with a massive hoard of treasure. Helen came home from her 7 years in Egypt with only one thing, an incredibly powerful narcotic. A narcotic, Homer tells us, so powerful that, in his words, quote, "It dissolves all grief and anger, and banishes remembrance of every sorrow. Whoever drinks this mixture will shed no tears that day, not even if both his mother and his father died, or if somebody came and stabbed his son or his brother in front of his very own eyes." So Helen had come into possession of this drug, and at this particular juncture in the transpiring to be miserable evening, Helen, the hostess, had excused herself from the dinner table, I suppose ostensibly to supervise the mixing of the wine, and then slipped a little bit of the narcotic into the gentlemen's drinks. Now, whether Helen slipped a little bit of the drug into her own wine, we don't know. Homer does not tell us, but Homer does imply two things. First of all, that the three men at the dinner table were quite unaware that their wine had been drugged. And second of all, and possibly more interesting for our gossip, Homer leaves us with the distinct impression that Helen had done this drugging of her husband's wine many times before. Well, the evening proceeded, and after a glass or two of the drugged wine, the evening went from being miserable and maudlin into being very, very interesting indeed. The mood improved, the pain vanished, and as the wine continued to flow, the answers to our two gossipy questions, ladies and gentlemen, well, those answers were soon provided. So here's what happened. At some point during the dining, Helen offered to tell the three gentlemen a story. "Sit here and eat, and I will entertain you with a story. Enjoy it. It is a story quite fitting to the times." Now, the story that Helen launched into, folks, was actually, on the surface at least, a story about Odysseus. But you didn't need to be too bright or to scrape too much beneath the surface of the story to realize that Helen was actually telling a story about herself, and what Helen was telling was not really so much a story, but a thesis disguised in story form. The story that she related involved Odysseus during the siege of the city of Troy. And Helen explained how, at some late stage in the siege of Troy, likely in the 9th year, Odysseus, in order to gather some reconnaissance and some intel on the situation inside of the Trojan walls, had deliberately disguised himself as a beggar and then had the crap beat out of him by fellow Greek warlords before slipping inside of Troy's walls. Well, Odysseus, at liberty, had wandered inside of the city, gathering the intel that he required, until he had stumbled across and come face to face with none other than Helen herself. And Helen, of course, had immediately recognized Odysseus through his clever disguise. Well, in her story, Helen explained that she had motioned to Odysseus and discreetly brought him back to her own quarters, where she had washed him, bathed him, dressed his wounds, and then listened to Odysseus explain to her the Greeks' master plan for taking the city of Troy. The plan, of course, involving Odysseus' famous wooden horse. And then, according to Helen, she had helped Odysseus to secretly slip outside of Troy and back to the safety of the Greek lines. And then Helen had concluded her story to the three gentlemen, explaining how she had felt about the entire evening and her visit with Odysseus. And I rejoiced in my heart, for I was already longing to go back home, and I deeply regretted the madness that Aphrodite had laid on my heart when she had enticed me there to Troy, and had made me abandon my people, my home, and my husband, a man as intelligent as he is handsome. And so that, folks, was, inside of Helen's story, a thinly veiled thesis on Helen's version of how she had ended up in Troy, abducted by Aphrodite, and how she had felt the entire time she was there, thoroughly and 100% sympathetic to Menelaus and the fellow Greeks' cause. And I will, of course, leave as food for your thought and your own personal interpretation and consideration the simile with which Helen had concluded her story, referring to Menelaus as my husband, a man as intelligent as he is handsome. And of course, that simile offers two profoundly different readings. And I will remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that nowhere in the collected body of literature on Menelaus is there any account of the man being particularly handsome. But, whatever the case, Helen concluded her story, and it might have been a good thing for all parties concerned had the evening ended there. It could have ended with a nice romantic moment. Menelaus could have reached over, gently touched Helen on the wrist and said, gee, honey, and I think you're pretty special too. And then the two of them could have repaired up to the bedroom, and Menelaus could have hoped he had not consumed too much wine to not end the evening in fine style. And ladies and gentlemen, if that had have been how the Helen-Menelaus evening had have ended, then, well, we would have charitably smiled and agreed, as outsiders observing it, that it was all for the best. Every marriage has its awkward and uncomfortable histories to deal with, and if Helen and Menelaus chose to paper over those Paris years with a story of Helen as a damsel in distress, very much in love with her husband Menelaus, then whether that story be fact or fiction, well, more power to the couple for managing to make something work of their marriage. But at that point in the evening, instead of calling it a good night, Menelaus, deep into his cups and feeling no pain, decided to counter his wife's story with an Odysseus story of his very own. Menelaus' story picked up with the night of Odysseus' famous wooden horse. Now you will recall that Odysseus' wooden horse was chock full of the finest warriors and the best thinkers in the entire Greek army, and that the Trojans had foolishly pulled that horse inside the safety of their own city walls. So all that was left now for the Greeks to do in order to win the Trojan War in a night was to stay quietly inside the hollow belly of that horse, wait until nightfall, wait until the people of Troy had fallen sound asleep, and then secretly exit from the hollow belly of that horse, open the gates of Troy from the inside, and invite Agamemnon and his 100,000 Greek soldiers to pour into the sleeping, unsuspecting city. But then, late in the evening, according to Menelaus' account of the story to his dinner guests, something unanticipated happened outside at the base of that wooden horse. According to Menelaus, who was one of the warriors hidden in the horse, alongside Odysseus incidentally, according to Menelaus, sometime late in the evening, he heard the voice of his wife, or his former wife, Helen. Now, apparently, Helen had decided to take an evening stroll at the base of the horse and was walking around the perimeter of the horse, tapping the hollow belly of the horse with her hands. And according to Menelaus, as Helen circled that horse, she was deliberately mimicking the voices of the wives of the Greek warlords currently hiding in the horse, calling out the men's names, pretending that she was that man's wife. Women that the men, of course, had not seen for 10 long years. And according to Menelaus, here's what happened inside of the horse. 3 times you went around the hollow belly, touching the hiding place and calling on us Greeks by name. You put on different voices for each man's wife. And as I sat there with the other warlords and with Odysseus, we heard you calling, and we were tempted to go out and meet you, or to call out to you from the inside. But immediately, Odysseus could sense our impulse, and he held us back, until you had walked away. Now, ladies and gentlemen, just pause to think about the situation that Menelaus is explaining. Had any one of the men inside of that horse called out to what he thought was his wife, well, all of the Greeks in the horse would have been revealed. And here's why, and this adds even more delicious element to Menelaus' story. On the night when Helen was walking around the outside of the horse, Helen was, according to Menelaus, accompanied by Deiphobus. And folks, you'll have to forgive me a small digression here. But in the last waning days of the Trojan War, Helen's husband Paris had been killed, and Helen had been summarily remarried to a crown prince in line for the Trojan throne named Deiphobus. And so on the night when Helen was circling the wooden horse, she was circling that horse in the company of a crown prince of Troy, her current husband, and a possible heir to the Trojan throne once old man Priam died. Now think about what might have happened if even so much as one of those men had have called out into the night. Deiphobus would have heard it, summoned the guards, and the wooden horse, of course, would have been summarily burned to the ground, with all of the best and the brightest of the Greeks burned alive inside that horse's hollow belly. And that, of course, would have put an end immediately to the entire Trojan War, with absolute and complete and total Trojan victory. And as to Helen, married to Deiphobus, well, it might have only been a matter of days or weeks until Helen eventually became the new queen of Troy. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Menelaus' story or thesis disguised as a story, was this. My wife Helen was a traitorous bitch, and she nearly cost the Greeks the war. She nearly killed me and you, young Telemachus. She nearly killed your dad, too. And ladies and gentlemen, well, the evening had taken a decidedly ugly turn for the worse. And I suppose what we could say is if in vino veritas, then, well, in drugged vino, perhaps a little bit too much veritas. And the ugliness of this marriage's unresolved and long-standing argument was now on display for all of the dinner guests to witness. And as to the unresolved question that we're interested in, who was telling the truth, Helen or Menelaus, and whose version of events is accurate, Helen or Menelaus's? Well, Homer quite playfully, and I imagine deliberately, leaves that as an open question. All I will personally conclude is that Helen's decision to drug her husband's wine with a drug which Homer reports, quote, takes all rage away, now seems as though it might be a sensible and precautionary thing for the woman to do. Well, the second day of the visit got off to a better start. First of all, Helen was nowhere in sight, and next, Menelaus in the morning proved to be in a positive, even effusive mood, and one wonders whether he even remembered the night before or whether Helen's drugs managed to take away memories of that sort of thing too. Whatever the case, Menelaus hunted down young Telemachus and Pisistratus and, sitting the two of them down, launched into an epic story of his time in Egypt, which would have done even old Nestor proud. But eventually, one ray or nugget of information of use to Telemachus actually emerged from Menelaus's tale. According to Menelaus, who had heard this according to a reliable eyewitness, as late as 1 year ago, Odysseus had been very much alive, apparently being held prisoner on the island of a minor goddess named Calypso. Well, Menelaus concluded his story, and then, appreciating how polite, eager, and enthusiastic his audience had appeared to be, Menelaus invited Telemachus and Pisistratus to stay with him and with Helen for an additional 11 or 12 days. And then Menelaus said, I quote, I will send you home with amazing guest gifts, 3 horses, a gleaming chariot, and a lovely cup, so that you can pour gifts to the gods and always think of me. And again, folks, young Telemachus had shown remarkably great diplomacy and tact. Here's what he said to Menelaus. Do not keep me here so long, my lord. Indeed, I would be glad to stay a year. I would not even miss my home. I get such pleasure listening to you. But my poor friends are surely tired of waiting in Pylos. You really have made me stay too long. And for the gift, well, please only give me treasure. You keep your lovely horses. I cannot transport them all the way back to Ithaca. And, well, in Ithaca there are no fields or racetracks. It is only really good for goats there. Islands out at sea have no good horse grazing, ours the very least of all. And of course, folks, Telemachus realized that the logistics of packing up 3 prize horses and a gleaming chariot, first for an overland journey and then for a journey by sea to Ithaca, well, that might have necessitated a lengthier stay in Sparta. So far better to sacrifice the chariot and horses and get out now with a lesser and more immediately transportable guest gift. And as to Menelaus, well, he seemed to not detect his young guest's haste to get out of Dodge. My boy, your words are proof of your good blood. So, of all the things in my hoard of treasure, I will give you my finest. A bowl crafted by the blacksmith god Hephaestus himself. And then Telemachus, after dodging yet another story that Menelaus was launching into, of how he had come to obtain a bowl apparently created by a god, Telemachus managed to effect his exit. And he and his traveling companion were back on the road, by chariot to Pylos, and then Telemachus on his own, by ship, back to Ithaca. So, though he still had not proven himself to be a soldier, young Telemachus, courtesy of Athena's rescue mission, had certainly acquired some of the confidence, some of the social graces, and some of the political insights necessary to someday becoming Ithaca's king. But, ladies and gentlemen, I would caution you to not exhale quite yet. Because at this point in the tale, Homer brings the action back to the island kingdom of Ithaca. First of all, into Odysseus's palace, where we meet Penelope, who is in quite the rage because she has just discovered why she has not seen her son Telemachus for the past week or so. And under some intense Penelope questioning, the housemaid had revealed that Telemachus had made her promise not to tell Mum, but that he had taken off on a road trip to Pylos and to Sparta. And Penelope's response to learning that Telemachus had slipped through her grasp and was off on a road trip tells us everything we need to know about Penelope's parenting priorities. Here's what she said to the house servant. "If I had learned that he had been planning this voyage, I swear he would never have left Ithaca, or it would have been over my dead body." And I think why Athena decided a road trip was necessary for the maturation and development of the lad is now pretty well clear. But then, Homer, having taken us in to show us Penelope's response to the road trip, takes us outside of the palace where we find the suitors. And Homer shares with us the suitors' response to the news that young Telemachus is currently out of town. Here's what happened. One of the lesser suitors approached the ringleader of the gang, the suitor named Antinous, with a question of Antinous. So Antinous, do you have any idea when Telemachus will be returning from Pylos? You see, he borrowed my ship and I need it back. I got to run some errands with it. And upon hearing the question, Antinous positively exploded. Can you believe it? That disrespectful young puppy, he's pulled off his expedition. The one we swore would never take place. Now he is sure to cause us more trouble. And any plans of the suitors to stage a bloodless coup, well, they evaporated instantly. It was clearly time to kill the heir apparent. Get me a ship. Get me 20 men. I will go lie in ambush for him in the straits between Ithaca and the mainland. And that is where Homer leaves our story. And me, taking my cue from Homer, this too is where I will leave our story and young Telemachus. So, ladies and gentlemen, in upcoming episode 10, we will be returning to the Odysseus parallel plotline story. And I will be telling you all of the amazing, interesting, and oh so fascinating things that have been happening to Odysseus while Athena has been busy rescuing Odysseus's young son. So now let's take a moment, refresh our water mugs or our coffee cups as the case may be, and then I invite you to dive with me into a particular interesting post-story commentary that I've prepared for you. I think you're going to have an awful lot of fun with it. And so welcome back to the post-story commentary, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I told you that what this post-story commentary was going to be was a sampler on cultural takes on Odysseus over time. Now, what that means is that I'm not going to be setting out to provide a comprehensive survey. Folks, there is simply way too much content over the last 2,500 years for me to attempt something like that inside of a commentary, let alone a full, complete podcast serial. So I'm going to begin with classical Greece, about 300 or so years following Homer's original Iliad and Odyssey. And in classical Greece, I'm going to explore the plays of Sophocles and of Euripides. And then I'm going to take a leap ahead to Rome. I'm going to dive into a more serious focus on Virgil's Aeneid. But you should know, folks, Odysseus shows up in a massive number of literary works, from Shakespeare through to 21st century novels. Odysseus shows up in opera, in television, on the big screen, and even as a character in 21st century video games. And of course, every writer, every director, every programmer who creates a guy named Odysseus for either a starring role or for a walk-on bit role in his or her artistic production has to make their own decision on just who Odysseus is going to be. So all my sampler is going to be is a jumping off place, and the works I've chosen are the ones which I consider to be the most famous or culturally resonant of the literally thousands of takes on our boy Odysseus. So, that caveat and qualifier in place, let's take a brief moment before we dive into our survey to establish a baseline starting point on the Odysseus character. And that baseline, of course, has to begin with Homer. So let's move back to circa 750 BCE or so to take a look at what Homer says about Odysseus in the Iliad, but primarily in the Odyssey. Now, folks, this is very familiar territory to all of we listeners, so I'm going to keep it brief. All I'm going to outline are what I consider to be the three defining characteristics of Odysseus as originally portrayed in Homer. And those three defining characteristics are: number one, his cunning, his creativity, and his tactical ability to problem solve by thinking outside of the box. Number two, his moral code as a situational pragmatist, or as a practitioner of metis wisdom, that the ends always justify the means. And finally, number three, Odysseus's mastery of words, of tall tales, of eloquent speeches, of clever wordplay, and sometimes of outright lies, as the central tool in his Polytropous toolbox. So, those are the three characteristics by which Homer portrays his character Odysseus. Let's move on to Homer's opinion of his character Odysseus. And folks, that's pretty easy and clear cut. Homer considers Odysseus to be a hero, capital H-E-R-O, hero. And folks, Homer expects that we listeners and we readers will, without exception, see Odysseus in that very same light. Ladies and gentlemen, especially inside of Homer's Odyssey, it is difficult, almost impossible, to find any commentary on the character of Odysseus coming from the pen of the Odyssey's omniscient narrator that is not overwhelmingly positive. And when Homer, the author, puts words into the mouths of the Odyssey's most authoritative judges of character, well, both Zeus and Athena, the only gods in the Odyssey who provide moral commentary, well, both Zeus and Athena agree that Odysseus is an all-round awesome and generally wonderful guy. So, there is our baseline take on Odysseus as we begin our sampler tour, provided to us by no less an authority than Homer himself. So now, let's move forward 300 to 400 years into classical Greece and see what the classical Greeks did with Odysseus. Did they hold on to the Homeric idea, or did they spin the character off in some other directions? And folks, I suppose, inadvertently used the word spin-off here, but let's stop and talk about this, because we, of course, in the 21st century, in the later 20th century, in television series and in movies, well, we think that we created the genre of the spin-off series. But it was actually the classical Greeks who came up with this little bit of marketing genius. And the classical Greek playwrights, particularly Euripides, Aeschylus, and Sophocles, recognized very quickly that if you want to really make your play popular, if you really want people to attend your productions and to award your plays first prize in theatrical festivals, then what you do is you don't give them new plot and characters. You go back to the plot and the characters that they have previously invested in. So, what we get inside of classical Greece is we get a host of plays all built around Homer. Now, when it comes to plays that actually focus in on Odysseus stories, well, the big two playwrights are Sophocles and especially Euripides. So the question we're going to ask is, do Sophocles or Euripides have any particular unique take on the Odysseus character, which is different or a tweaking or a variation on what Homer offered in his Iliad or Odyssey? And the short answer is yes. Folks, Sophocles gave us two plays which feature Odysseus as lead character. The first play was titled Ajax. It arrived on the stage circa 440 BCE. And then a few years later on the stage, circa 409 BCE, Sophocles penned a play called Philoctetes. Now, folks, the two Sophocles plays actually form a really interesting contrast. In the play Ajax, Odysseus employs his considerable verbal rhetorical arsenal towards noble, laudable, and virtuous ends. And then a few years later, in the play Philoctetes, well, the same guy, Odysseus, uses his very same verbal arsenal, if you will, towards purposes of evil and corruption of innocence. Now, what Sophocles does inside of his play Philoctetes is he has Odysseus, an evil, conniving liar wordsmith, in the company of a young, noble, and virtuous boy that you might have heard of called Neoptolemus, Achilles' son. Now, inside of the play, Odysseus is evil, Neoptolemus is virtuous and good. And as the play progresses, folks, more and more Odysseus tries to corrupt young Neoptolemus into abandoning his high moral principles and engaging in shameless lying and deceit. So there's a quick little bit of dialogue I'll read you. Here goes. Odysseus trying to manipulate Neoptolemus. I know, my boy. I know that this sort of thing is not in your character. You don't like uttering such lying nonsense, nor do you like plotting against people. But you must also know what a delight it is to gain a victory after that sort of a struggle. To which young, innocent, noble Neoptolemus replies, Oh, distressing words make for distressing deeds, Odysseus, son of Laertes. And it is not in my nature, nor was it in my father's nature, to do treacherous things. Now let's move on to Euripides. Now, folks, Euripides wrote a whole ton of plays, and we've lost some of them, but there's still a whole whack of them that are extant for us to look at. And Euripides was writing his plays circa 480 to 406 BCE. Now, unlike Sophocles, who shows some balance and gives us Odysseus's words for good in one play versus Odysseus's words for evil in another play, well, Euripides is consistent right down the line in all of his plays that feature Odysseus. And every one of those plays, ladies and gentlemen, is a total hatchet job on our boy. So let's start with a play called Hecuba. And if you want to go back to the story behind it, then you'll want to listen to Trojan War, the podcast, episode number 20. Now, the plot of this play is simple. The Greeks have to decide, after the fall of the city of Troy, whether to sacrifice a daughter of the Trojan royal family, a girl named Polyxena, at the tomb of Achilles. There's a big debate inside of the Greek army on whether this is necessary in order to gain favorable wins for the Greeks heading back home to their own country. Now, the Greeks are undecided. Some people say sacrifice the teenage girl. Other Greeks are saying there's been enough death already. Let's not sacrifice any more teenage girls still. And then in this play, Odysseus steps in and uses his eloquent skills of rhetorical persuasion, of course, to convince the Greeks to kill the girl Polyxena. And Euripides' most succinct description of Odysseus in his play Hecuba, it would likely be this quote, describing Odysseus as follows, quote, "That shifty-hearted butcher knife, that sweet-coaxing, pandering son of Laertes." So now let's move on to the next Euripides play, titled The Women of Troy. And again, Trojan War, the podcast, episode 20, will give you the backstory you need here. So let's start with a quick plot synopsis. The city of Troy has fallen, and Queen Hecuba of Troy has just received the news that the Trojan royal women are to be doled out as prizes of war to various and sundry Greek warlords. And further, Hecuba has just been informed that it is her fate to be doled out to Odysseus. She is going to be sent back to Ithaca with him as a slave. And in the play, Hecuba laments as follows, I quote, "So now I belong to a perjured, impious outcast who defies man's law and God's, a monster of wickedness, whose tongue twists straight to crooked, truth to lies, friendships to hate, a man who mocks right and honors wrong." And folks, if that is not damnation enough of our boy Odysseus, I will remind you that inside of this play by Euripides, it is Odysseus who takes the infant heir to the Trojan throne, the baby Astyanax, and hurls him violently to his death over the city walls. In other sources, there's some debates on whether this act of infanticide was conducted by Neoptolemus or by Odysseus, but in Euripides' play, it is Odysseus who kills babies too. Now, folks, I could go on because there is the play Palamedes, and there's also the play Iphigenia at Aulis, and both of them managed to do hatchet jobs on our boy Odysseus. But I think you get the general idea of what Euripides was up to. So just a couple of final comments on Euripides before we move on. And here I want to quote the eminent scholar, author, and critic W.B. Stanford, who wrote a book titled The Quest for Ulysses. And in the 256 pages of that book, well, here's what Stanford says about Euripides and his take on the Odysseus character. I quote, "Euripides' blackening of Odysseus' character had a lasting influence on classical drama. The serviceable diplomat and statesman of Homer's Iliad is transformed by Euripides into a detestable politique whom no humane writer could admire." And folks, I think that, W.B. Stanford has pretty well hit it on the head. But possibly full disclosure is in order here, because Stanford points out that Euripides' blackening of Odysseus' character had a lasting influence on classical drama. But if you go back to Trojan War, the podcast, I think you will very quickly see that in my selection of Odysseus stories, Euripides had a lasting influence on not only classical drama, but on Jeff Wright's Trojan War, the podcast, portrayal of Odysseus too. So, now let's move on to the major and historically defining take on Odysseus/Ulysses, which shows up inside of Virgil's Aeneid. Now, folks, when I get into talking about the Aeneid, I'm into talking about a masterwork of world literature, at least as critical, significant, and important in its cultural impact on our thinking up to today, as is the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I'm going to cover Virgil in about 4.5 to 5 minutes. So just recognize that I could very, very, very easily create the Aeneid, the podcast, and add 25 hours and barely scrape the surface of the Aeneid either. So here's what we need to know. Virgil wrote his Aeneid circa 19 BCE, so about 700 years after Homer wrote his Odyssey. And what the Aeneid is an epic poem in the style of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So here's the basic plot line. On the night when Troy falls, a Trojan prince named Aeneas, and you will find him playing a bit role all through Trojan War, the podcast. Well, on the night when Troy falls, this particular Trojan prince Aeneas led a group of refugees out of the burning city. And then Aeneas, leading those refugees, wandered for quite a few years, fought quite a few major battles, and ultimately settled down and found a nation which we now call Rome. So let's go back a bit, because the critical thing that ties Aeneas into our takes on Odysseus has to do with what happened on the night when Troy fell. Inside of Virgil's Aeneid, Virgil recounts in detail the story of Odysseus's wooden horse. And just a bit of an aside here, folks, I know I'm being geeky, but the story of the wooden horse is not, of course, recounted or even referenced inside of Homer's Iliad. And the only reference to the wooden horse shows up in that little conversation between Helen, Menelaus, and Telemachus inside of Homer's Odyssey. So most of what we know of what happened on the night of the wooden horse actually comes pretty well direct from Virgil's Aeneid. But here's the thing that you need to know. Folks, the Aeneid was all kinds of things, but one of the things that Virgil was doing when he wrote his Aeneid is he was writing a foundational myth for the nation of Rome. And by the time that Virgil was writing, well, imperial Rome was doing very, very well indeed. But what the Romans really, really needed, or Virgil decided that what the Romans really, really needed, was an origin backstory that cast the Roman people as noble and heroic and virtuous and all-round wonderful. And what Virgil decided to do was to take the story of the Trojan War and trace the Romans that he was writing for, trace their ancestry back not to the victorious Greeks inside of that war, but instead back to the Trojans who, as you know, lost the Trojan War. And if you go to Imperial Rome inside of Virgil's own time, you will find that there were members of the Roman 1% ruling class who could all very proudly trace their family ancestry all the way back to the crown princes of Troy and to Aeneas himself. But ladies and gentlemen, if you think about this, it actually presented Virgil with a little bit of a problem because, well, he was tracing his Roman audience's ancestry back to, well, if you will, a bunch of losers. The Trojans lost the Trojan War. And it seems on the surface like a rather improbable national origin myth to trace your ancestry back to the losers and not to the heroic winners of the war. And so what Virgil did to square this polemic, political, or cultural problem, if you will, was to retell the story of the fall of Troy in such a fashion that it became very clear that the only reason the Trojans lost is because the noble, heroic, virtuous, and honest Trojans were deceived by the crooked, tricksy, evil, underhanded, and cowardly Greeks. And immediately, folks, you can see where this is going to go. Because the great deception which caused Troy to fall and burn was Odysseus's wooden horse. And ladies and gentlemen, under the pen of Virgil, Odysseus became the arch evil, terrible, lying, tricksy corrupter who led to the fall of Troy. So that's Virgil's take on Odysseus. So why does it matter so much? And folks, here a quick little history lesson is in order. Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, well, they both vanished from Western Europe sometime around 400 or so, with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And the Iliad and the Odyssey were not reborn or renaissanced, if that's even a word, back into Western Europe until sometime in the 1400s, when the Greek texts were discovered or found or noticed in the formerly Roman Eastern Empire, and then usually translated into Latin and brought back to the West. But, unlike Homer's Odyssey and Homer's Iliad, Virgil's Aeneid was never, ever, ever lost from Europe. In fact, the reverse. Virgil's Aeneid became the defining work which an educated man, and it was men then, would read as part of their studies. Not only would they read the Aeneid, they would practice writing it, they would memorize sections of it. It was a defining intellectual and cultural text. And so, Virgil's take on tricksy Odysseus, a Greek who you should beware of, even when he brings you gifts. Well, Virgil's take got about 1,000-year head start in Europe as the authoritative take on Odysseus before Homer was rediscovered and people got to look at what Homer said about our boy. So, time for me to say goodbye. Have yourselves awesome days. Thanks for listening, and we will talk again very soon.